They had already learned to stop asking questions inside the camps because nothing was ever explained and nothing behaved the way captivity was supposed to behave. But what they were not prepared for was discovering that the world outside the wire did not reflect the shortages they had known for years. From behind fences and routines shaped by repetition, they began to notice something that felt deeply wrong to men who had lived through scarcity, rationing, and absence, because beyond their confinement, food did not appear limited at all. What unsettled them was not what they were given, but what they could see, and once that realization took hold, it changed the way they understood everything they had left behind. By the time the men had settled into the routines of captivity, the camp itself had become a world defined by repetition, predictability, and quiet adjustment, where daily life unfolded without explanation and expectations were shaped by what continued rather than what was promised. Inside this controlled environment, scarcity had been assumed, even when food appeared regularly, because habit and experience taught them that limitation was always present, whether visible or not. What challenged this assumption did not come from the meals served inside the camp, but from brief glimpses beyond the wire, moments when the boundaries of captivity allowed them to observe a world that did not match the one they believed existed. During work details near roads, rail lines, or nearby towns, the prisoners began to notice scenes that fell out of place, not because they were dramatic, but because they were ordinary. Trucks passed carrying supplies without visible restriction. Shops displayed goods openly, and civilians moved through streets without the careful calculations that had defined life under rationing. These observations were not explained, acknowledged, or addressed by the guards, leaving the men to interpret them on their own through the lens of years shaped by shortage and control. At first, the prisoners assumed that what they were seeing must be staged, temporary, or exaggerated by distance. The idea that food could be available in such quantities felt incompatible with everything they had been taught about the war, about scarcity, and about survival. They had learned to accept substitutes, to measure portions, and to live with absence as a constant condition. Yet the images beyond the wire continued to appear. Stores remained stocked. Delivery trucks returned day after day. Civilian life moved forward without visible signs of deprivation. The consistency of these scenes unsettled the prisoners more than any single observation ever could. Inside the camp, routines continued unchanged. Meals were served. Work details were assigned. Guards maintained their quiet presence. Nothing in the structure of captivity suggested that what the prisoners were seeing was an exception or a mistake. The system did not react to their attention, and no explanation followed. For men who had learned to interpret every detail as a signal of control, this lack of response created a deep uncertainty. They could not reconcile what they were given inside the camp with what they were witnessing outside it, and without guidance, they were left to question assumptions that had once felt unshakable. By the end of those early observations, the prisoners had not reached conclusions. They had only recognized that the world beyond the wire did not reflect the scarcity they had endured, and that this realization would quietly reshape the way they understood both captivity and the war itself. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the days passed, those brief glimpses beyond the wire stopped feeling accidental and began to settle into the prisoner's awareness as a pattern, because repetition carried a weight that single moments never could. Each time work details brought them closer to roads, storage areas, or nearby towns, the same scenes appeared again, unchanged and unhidden, as though abundance itself required no explanation. They noticed delivery trucks moving freely, loaded with crates and supplies that did not suggest careful rationing or emergency conservation. Storefronts displayed goods openly, shelves appeared full, and civilians carried packages without the guarded restraint the prisoners had known for years. These were not fleeting images, and they were not corrected or concealed when noticed. For men shaped by scarcity, this visibility was deeply unsettling. They had learned to assume that shortages defined everyone's experience, that deprivation was universal, and that survival required constant adjustment. What they were now witnessing challenged that assumption at its core, because it suggested that the absence they had endured was not shared equally. At first, many tried to rationalize what they saw. Some believed these scenes must represent carefully selected areas, designed to project an image rather than reflect reality. Others assumed the supplies were temporary, perhaps gathered for a specific purpose or moment. These explanations offered comfort because they preserved a familiar understanding of the world. Yet the scenes did not change. The trucks returned. The stores remained stocked. Civilian routines continued without visible disruption. There was no sign that what the prisoners were seeing was exceptional or staged, and no indication that scarcity lurked just beyond view. Inside the camp, nothing addressed this contradiction. Guards did not comment on what lay beyond the fences, and no effort was made to limit what the prisoners could observe. The system remained silent, leaving the men to reconcile these images on their own. This silence proved more troubling than denial ever could. Without correction or explanation, the prisoners were forced to confront the possibility that their understanding of the war, of scarcity, and of shared hardship might be incomplete. The realization did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It settled slowly through repeated observation and quiet reflection. As the pattern became undeniable, the men began to adjust not their behavior, but their assumptions. They stopped dismissing what they saw as illusion or coincidence, and began to accept that the world beyond the wire followed rules they had not experienced. This acceptance did not bring clarity. It brought unease. By the end of these repeated encounters, the prisoners had not yet drawn conclusions about what this meant for them or for the war itself. They had only recognized that what should not have existed, according to everything they believed, continued to exist in plain sight, and that this contradiction would linger long after the work details ended. As repeated observations slowly reshaped the prisoners' understanding of the world beyond the wire, the absence of explanation inside the camp became increasingly difficult to ignore because nothing in their experience had prepared them to reconcile visible abundance with a system that remained silent about its meaning. What they saw outside continued to exist without concealment, and what they experienced inside continued unchanged, forcing them to adapt without guidance. The men did not speak openly about these observations at first. Experience had taught them that drawing attention to contradictions rarely brought clarity, and that silence was often the safer response. Instead, they processed the realization individually, allowing it to settle alongside other unspoken adjustments they had already made since their capture. Inside the camp, routines followed their established rhythm. Meals were served. Work details were assigned. Guards maintained their quiet presence. Nothing in the structure of daily life acknowledged the contrast between scarcity endured and abundance observed. The system appeared indifferent to the prisoner's awareness, as though interpretation itself was not considered relevant. This indifference altered how the men related to their own expectations. They had learned to measure survival by preparing for loss, by assuming that deprivation was universal and inevitable. Now, that assumption no longer aligned with what they could see, yet without explanation, They were left to navigate this contradiction alone. Some attempted to reinterpret the meaning of what they observed. They reasoned that abundance elsewhere did not necessarily imply ease, or that supplies visible in one place might conceal shortages in another. These explanations offered temporary balance, but they did not fully resolve the discomfort created by repeated exposure to scenes that contradicted years of experience. Over time, the effort to rationalize gave way to a quieter form of adjustment. The men stopped searching for explanations that would restore familiar narratives and instead accepted that their understanding of the war might be incomplete. This acceptance did not come with relief. It came with a sense of distance, as though the world they had known was slipping further away with each passing day. What remained consistent was the absence of response from those in control. Guards did not correct assumptions or offer context. They simply continued their routines, allowing the contrast between inside and outside to exist without acknowledgement. In doing so, the system forced the prisoners to adapt internally rather than externally. By the time this adjustment settled, the men had begun to understand that captivity in this place was not only about confinement, but about exposure to a reality they could not reconcile with their past. The lack of answers did not resolve the contradiction. It made it permanent. What deepened the prisoners' unease was not only what they saw beyond the wire, but the complete lack of reaction to it from those who controlled their daily lives. Because authority, as they had known it, usually responded quickly to shifts in awareness or understanding. Here, however, nothing changed, and that silence carried its own weight. The guards continued their routines with the same measured consistency, assigning work details, overseeing movement, and maintaining order without addressing what lay just outside the boundaries of the camp. There were no warnings about where to look, no efforts to redirect attention, and no explanations offered to frame what the prisoners were witnessing. The system did not attempt to manage perception. It simply allowed it to exist. In other environments the men had known, information itself had been treated as a resource, carefully controlled and selectively revealed. Here, the visibility of abundance was neither hidden nor emphasized. It remained present, ordinary, and unremarkable in the eyes of those enforcing captivity, as though it required no justification. This lack of response forced the prisoners to confront a difficult realization. If the system did not react to their awareness, then perhaps awareness itself was irrelevant to how captivity functioned. Control was not maintained through shaping understanding or correcting assumptions, but through routine and predictability that continued regardless of what the prisoners perceived. Some men expected that their observations would eventually trigger restriction, that work details would be altered or access reduced once the contradiction became obvious. Yet nothing followed. The same routes were taken. The same scenes were visible. The system absorbed their awareness without adjusting its behavior. Over time, this indifference altered how the prisoners understood authority. They had been conditioned to interpret power through reaction, through visible efforts to manage behavior and belief. Here, power appeared uninterested in interpretation altogether. It did not correct misunderstanding. It did not explain reality. It simply persisted. This persistence made resistance meaningless in a familiar sense. There was nothing to oppose and nothing to challenge. The prisoners could not argue with what they saw, nor could they force an explanation from those who offered none. The absence of response closed off avenues of interpretation rather than clarifying them. As days passed, the men began to accept that the contrast between inside and outside would remain unresolved. The system showed no intention of bridging that gap. Captivity, it seemed, did not depend on controlling what prisoners knew, but on controlling the space in which they lived. By allowing the world beyond the wire to exist in plain sight without comment, the camp reinforced a quiet truth. Understanding was not required for compliance, and confusion did not weaken control. In some ways, it strengthened it because it forced adjustment without resolution. As the days continued to pass and the scenes beyond the wire remained unchanged, the prisoners slowly stopped reacting to what they saw, not because it had been explained or justified, but because repetition had begun to dull its impact. What once felt shocking and impossible to reconcile gradually became part of the background of their captivity, absorbed into daily life through sheer familiarity. The stores remained full. Trucks continued to arrive and depart. Civilians moved through their routines without visible signs of shortage or urgency. Each repeated sighting reduced the effort required to process the contradiction, even though understanding never followed. The men no longer paused to question what they saw, because the questions themselves had grown heavy and unresolved. This shift altered how the prisoners experienced time. Days were no longer marked by moments of surprise or discovery, but by steady repetition that left little room for interpretation. The world beyond the wire did not change, and neither did the routines inside the camp. Together, they formed a fixed contrast that no longer demanded attention. For some prisoners, this normalization created a quiet sense of detachment. The war, once defined by scarcity and survival, began to feel distant and abstract, as though it belonged to a different life that no longer aligned with what they were witnessing. For others, the contrast deepened a sense of separation, reinforcing the idea that their understanding of the world had been shaped by conditions that did not apply everywhere. What remained most unsettling was not abundance itself, but the realization that it could exist alongside captivity without conflict. The prisoners were not denied the sight of it, nor were they invited to understand it. It simply existed, indifferent to their presence and their past. Over time, the effort to reconcile these observations faded. The men adapted not by resolving the contradiction, but by accepting that it would remain unanswered. The world beyond the wire became something observed rather than interpreted, a constant reminder that reality did not behave as they had been taught to expect. In this way, abundance lost its power to shock. It became ordinary, not because it made sense, but because it endured. The system did not require the prisoners to understand what they saw. It required only that they continue to live within the boundaries set for them. By the time this adjustment fully settled, the contrast between scarcity endured and abundance observed no longer provoked reaction. It simply existed, shaping perception quietly and persistently, until the extraordinary became familiar, and familiarity replaced disbelief. For the men held behind the wire, captivity in America was shaped not only by what they were given, but by what they could see without being able to reach. The world beyond the fences did not reflect the scarcity that had defined their lives for years, and that contrast lingered quietly, reshaping how they understood both the war and their place within it. What unsettled them most was not abundance itself, but its indifference. Stores remained full without explanation. Supplies moved freely without secrecy. Civilian life continued without visible strain, and nothing in the structure of captivity acknowledged this contradiction or attempted to explain it away. The system allowed the reality to exist without comment, leaving the prisoners to adapt without understanding. Over time, the need to question faded, not because answers were found, but because repetition made questioning unsustainable. The men learned to accept what they could not reconcile, allowing the contrast between inside and outside to become part of the background of their daily lives. Abundance became something observed rather than interpreted, a reality that did not invite participation or explanation. In this environment, captivity was not defined by constant deprivation or visible force, but by separation. The prisoners were close enough to see a world that continued without them, yet confined within routines that did not respond to awareness or expectation. Understanding was not required. Adjustment was. The stores full of food were never meant to be a lesson or a message. They were simply there, part of a reality that existed alongside captivity without conflict. And in that quiet coexistence, the prisoners came to understand that the most unsettling part of their confinement was not what they lacked, but what they could see and never reach. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.